We're still waiting for word from the White House about a deal with Republicans to end the shutdown and raise the debt ceiling, albeit in a kick the can down the road kind of way. Sounds familiar. Here's what we do know. There is a fundamental divide in America when it comes to governing. Are we simply at an intellectual crossroads, or is there something much deeper at work? That's the question our next guest focused on. And he says your political leanings are half environmental, what you read, where you live, who you hang out with, and half genetic. Joining us now, Avi Tuschman, who holds a doctorate in evolutionary anthropology and is the author of the new book, Our Political Nature, The Evolutionary Origins of What Divides Us. Mr. Tuschman, I want to hear what you have to say, but I'm a little bit skeptical, and I want you to use your research and tell me where I'm wrong, because I feel like our political leanings are completely about nurture, where we grow up, who we grow up with, and even look at the sort of history of black people and our voting tendencies in America. Post-Lincoln, we were very Republican for obvious reasons. And then when FDR introduces the New Deal, we change almost completely to become Democrats, and the Democratic identification with for black people has grown more and more and more over time. Certainly there was no genetic change. There was just sort of change in politics, change in the nurture, change in understanding of how the parties were going to react to us. So your ideas on how genetics rather than nurture factors into this.
Thank you very much for having me today. And I very much appreciate that you pointed out that study after study shows that between 40 and 60% of the variation in our political attitudes comes from genetic differences between individuals. But the rest does come from environment and history and culture. So to answer your other question, over time the different parties change and the sense of words changes, but we shouldn't conflate that with ideologies. So the different parties espouse different kinds of ideologies, even though their names and their followers change over time.
Yeah. And Avi, you write about sort of three personality clusters. You talk about tribalism, authority, and inequality. Explain to us how much of that, in your view of the research, is innate and how much of it develops. For example, we know that humans and primates have a sense of fairness in studies. How much of that comes from the innate place versus what they may learn through being in a society?
Right. So as I mentioned, about 40 to 60% of this variation in our political attitudes, which arises from these three clusters of measurable personality traits, comes from genetic differences. And as you pointed out, throughout the book, I show how there's similar behavior in non-human primates and how this relates to our evolutionary history as a species.
Well, and Avi, one thing that's been interesting and incredibly frustrating and dismaying to observe in American politics is we've also had this asymmetry in terms of the dysfunction in Washington. You have the extreme right represented through the Tea Party, but we also had a pretty far left movement in reaction to the economic collapse. Occupy Wall Street. They don't have any political representation. Is there some sort of evolutionary explanation for why the far right got involved in our politics and the far left sort of stayed outside of it?
That's a very interesting question, Crystal. So even though from country to country the political spectrum has an essential underlying structure that remains the same, and you can immediately see this is true when you think of certain controversial issues like gay marriage, for example, that invariably polarize political spectrums everywhere in the same way. But despite these commonalities, political spectrums are also quite flexible in a number of ways. So for one example, when people are exposed to economic stress, political spectrums have a tendency to expand, and they do so in both directions. And people polarize in function of their predispositions. So if people are a little bit more leaning to the left, they'll go further. So in the fallout of the 2008 global financial crisis here, on the far left we saw the emergence here in the United States of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And at the same time, to the far right of the conventional Republican Party, we saw the Tea Party movement come about. Now, as you mentioned, there is an asymmetry. The Tea Party movement was able to elect legislators to our lower house of Congress, and this is one of the factors that's contributed to the extreme political polarization that we're dealing with right now. This could be just a historical idiosyncrasy that there wasn't a leader who emerged on the far left, or it's also possible that there are different personality traits that are common on both of these extremes. In particular, different attitudes towards authority could play into this. I think you've noticed that there was a strain of anarchism that ran through some of the Tea Party movement.
So they would be sort of opposed to getting involved with government because of that leaning.
Well, and it's interesting. It seems like we are ignoring the fact that there is a broad middle that exists today. In a recent survey, as we pointed out earlier, the NBC Esquire survey, it suggests that the argument we often hear that there is no middle ground between the left and the right, that's actually wrong. And in fact, I think it says 51% of the electorate falls in the middle. And that's where I find myself. But I often feel alone. And Tori will often tell me that I'm very much on an island, that no one is actually in the middle of the political spectrum. I want your take on this. Do you think there actually is around 51% that find themselves in the middle? And if that's the case, where the heck are these people? And why do we find these smaller groups on the far ends of the spectrum dominating the narrative?
Yeah, how wrong is Ture, I guess?
Ture is absolutely 100% correct. As I mentioned...
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. You're coming back, sir.
So I'm all alone then, I guess.
No, you're not alone. Political spectrums form a natural bell-shaped curve, which means that most people are in the middle. The problem is that there is a whole other spectrum that runs through public opinion in addition to left-right attitudes. And this is a spectrum of political coherence. So when you look at political elites, politicians, media, people who have greater levels of interest in politician or greater levels of education, they tend to have more stable, more coherent political attitudes over time.
So it sounds like I'm just better educated than Tori is what you're saying.
Oh! Hopefully, Obamacare can help me with that burn. Avi Tuschman, thank you very much. Up next, how to successfully ask for and get what you want. I can think of some folks who could use that advice right now. Avi, I'm looking at you.